This is the Nielsen Norman Group UX podcast.
I'm Therese Fessenden. Great designs rarely need instructions to use them. So it's unsurprising that many designers follow this principle and rely upon things like icons and iconography to communicate meaning. This might seem, in theory, like a good thing. We're communicating in ways other than written words and reading, and ideally, that means we can communicate things more quickly and efficiently since reading's not necessary. But in practice, simplicity is not as easy and as straightforward as having people read less. Today, we are featuring an episode with Kate Kaplan. She's an insights architect at Nielsen Norman Group who's been spending the last year or so researching icons, looking for answers to some of the common questions that we get about iconography. Are there icons that are ubiquitous enough to never need labels? Are there icons that can just speak for themselves? What are the best icons for different scenarios? Her latest book, Digital Icons That Work, offers us some much-awaited answers to these questions and many more. You'll hear us chat about the value that icons bring to a design, what differentiates icons from other types of small-scale graphics, and how designers can effectively simplify their interfaces by thoughtfully using these workhorses of digital design. With that, here's Kate. Kate, welcome to our show. We're so excited to have you here. And I'm really excited to get to know more of the research that you've been heads down doing for the past year now. Has it been a year?
It's been at least a year that I've been under this metaphorical icon rock. Because honestly, there's quite a bit to say about icons, more than I really thought when I started on this project.
Yeah. So can you share a bit, like, how did this research project come to be? And I remember, just to kind of give some context to our listeners, I do some courses in web page UX and in emerging patterns. And one of the things that constantly comes up is like, well, we want to make interfaces a lot simpler. Why can't we just reduce the words that people read? And why can't we just rely on icons? And in many ways, lots of great designs do use icons. But not every icon is created equal, I take it. And so I would love to know just what did this research project, how did it come to be, I guess is the right place to start.
Yeah, let me take you back in time. It's been a fun deep dive here, and I have spent a great deal of time thinking about icons. I'm glad to have a little platform here to talk about them. This started out as like a pebble in my shoe almost, like something that's kind of irritating, but easy to ignore. But over time you go, I have to address this thing. This is what this story is about, the pebble in my shoe. So I also teach a course that has a lot to do with icons. I teach this course on complex application design. And one of the really great sections in there that I love spending some time talking about is this conversation around the inherent trade-off of clutter and capability that we encounter in all applications, but especially complex applications that have a lot of capability. The more functionality something has, the more space we need to represent doorways into those functionalities in an interface, that means more stuff. And oftentimes that's where, just like you were describing, icons play a role in the conversation because they can be a way to create efficiencies in space. They offer a host of benefits, but they are not all created equal, as you said. And poorly designed icons or icons that are not meaningful to people do not do that job. They actually create confusion rather than clarity, and they create clutter. And so when we get into this conversation in the course, one of the great simple questions that I often get is, well, in light of that, are there universal icons? Or are there at least icons that we can say with some relative degree of confidence, people look at, and as a general population, we understand what they mean more so than others? And I would get that question a lot. And it started to really nag me that I really couldn't provide a straightforward answer to that straightforward question, because while we probably have our like intuitions about icons being more or less understood or recognizable, like some are things that have been part of our vocabulary for a long time, some are emerging. Really, there wasn't any data to answer that question. And I wanted data to answer that question. And I didn't really see anything out there that really dove into this in other studies either, right? So the more I heard this question, the more it started to nag at me, the more I got kind of bothered that I couldn't answer it in a sound way. And so that's what led to this research, really, a desire to answer that nagging question.
Got it. Yeah. And again, like you said, this question comes up time and time again. Why do you think designers are so obsessed with icons? And like, I feel like I see icons in basically every beginning designer's portfolio, not necessarily icons by themselves, although certainly there might be graphic designers that are doing that. But what I mean is like folks who are using and basically inundating their interfaces with icons with very few words, or otherwise introducing icons, maybe even ones I've never seen before in their, in their either in their portfolio or in their concept art. Are they all that they're cracked up to be? Maybe that's a leading question, but what value do you think icons bring to a design?
Yeah, I think like you use the word obsession, Therese, which I think is like a funny word, but a good one to describe maybe the complicated relationship that we probably as designers or UX professionals have with icons. Because I think we're into them and we're obsessed with them in a way because they are fun. They're like inherently visual. They can have a personality. They can be a creative outlet for the work that we do. But I also think there's kind of this inherent paradox to icons, which makes them tricky. It takes a lot of skill to get them right and to effectively integrate them into designs in a way that, has all this value, like creating clarity and creating efficiencies and learning and increased satisfaction and all the other things we can talk about that icons can do. But the paradox is that they're small, right? They're tiny in the grand scheme of things. And that can make them feel, I think, even subconsciously, a little bit inconsequential or frivolous even, or just kind of unimportant when it comes to the bigger picture of the experience. But the paradox's play is that, yes, they are small, but really they can have a huge impact on the overall experience. And I think you'll like this metaphor, Therese. This is something that I talk about in the book, is that one day I was sitting around at my house thinking about icons, as I often do, you can imagine.
As one does.
Right? Exactly. And I thought, you know what? It came to me that icons, in a sense, are kind of like a really nice wine, really, if you'll hear me out. Good icons are subtle, sure, but they are memorable, hopefully. Mm-hmm. They should be kind of quietly sophisticated, adding something to the table, much like a good wine, right? Yeah, they're humble in a sense, but they're also a really vital part of achieving all these things we aspire to when it comes to creating experiences like higher levels of efficiency and learnability, memorability, findability of key functions, just satisfaction, even like I said, and enjoyment of what we're doing.
Yeah. And I even think about the word icon itself. Like when we talk about cultural icons, we think about movie stars, like musicians, like icons are these people who we really look up to, who stand for something. And in a way, that's what you're saying, right? These are small, perhaps, maybe just individuals. Like if you think about a literal person as an icon, they're individuals who have immense power. And in a way, a lot of the best iconography is, as in, the literal icons you choose to use, will have a lot of meaning when used the right way.
I love what you just said, Therese. Icons stand for something. And I know you're talking about iconic people and places and that way of using the term, but it is so true and relevant for icons in digital design as well. They should stand for something. They should add something. They should mean something, not just be pure decoration in a design.
Yeah. I remember when I first started in the industry, like I was a very new visual designer. I remember hearing terms like logos and icons and like, I'm just thinking like emojis, for example. And I remember when I was pretty new, I was like, these all kind of sound the same. Like these are all like little images. But how would you define like just to level set a little bit, how would you define like an icon versus a logo, for example?
Great question. I mean, really at its core, an icon is just a visual representation of an idea or an action or a concept in a certain environment. It has a specific meaning to convey. I almost think about it like a shorthand communication that should, at a glance, give direction, instruction, or clarity to the environment, the digital environment in this case, that people are trying to navigate. A logo doesn't really do that, does it? It's like, it's a visual representation of maybe a personality, or it stands for something that that brand is trying to communicate, be, or aspire to, but it doesn't have the same job to do in helping us navigate an environment. These are tools that we use to make sense of the environment we're in.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful distinction because back then when I was pretty new, it's like these all have similar characteristics. Like certainly a logo does stand for something, but it's more like you're saying, it's more a personality, maybe a brand and organization, something a bit more general. Whereas like icons are a lot more specific versions of that, where people are using them in a way to make sense of an interface, to take action on an interface, or basically, to navigate in many ways. Yeah.
Navigate and make sense of the world we're in. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we're all trying to do.
Yes. Now, on that note, was there anything kind of surprising in how people used these icons? Was there anything that stood out in your research that you think, wow, that's kind of, I didn't expect to see that?
Yeah. And just for context here, we have done a lot of research on these icons, right? And so we've kind of approached this question from a quantitative perspective and a qualitative perspective. So we've watched people encounter icons in context, out of context of digital interfaces, and collected a lot of interpretations and associations with these icons. And one of the things that really stood out to me was just how ambiguous and open to interpretation almost all icons are, right? So even the icons that we might think of as relatively safe, or icons that are ones that we see a lot and they're used pretty consistent, they might even have a standard, even those are still interpreted in different ways, definitely dependent on context, definitely dependent on people's past exposure to them and past experiences with digital interfaces and other things, right? So it was really fascinating to see that how even very common, frequently encountered icons sometimes held very different meanings for folks, right? If you think about the typical profile icon that you'd see, like when you log into an application or a website, and I'm thinking about like that silhouette icon that is just kind of like an outline of an abstract figure, a head and kind of like the shoulders. That icon is one of the ones in our study that was pretty well recognized, pretty well understood. It was pretty well consistent across the way different interfaces and designers are using it. Yet, even with something pretty ubiquitous, there were still these really interesting pockets of themes of how people interpreted that. So, for instance, a smaller but still important chunk of people saw that profile icon, even in the typical placement where you would expect to see a profile icon. And they said, oh, those are my contacts, or those are my groups, right? Like you would see contacts in a phone or something like that. And I think that's where this conversation gets really interesting in terms of unpacking and trying to understand how so many factors, so many things like age, like lived experience, like your experience level with technology, interactive products in general, your geographic location, your accessibility related needs or differences, they all are working in this kind of puzzle ball of factors that are influencing how you interpret something and assign meaning to something. And so it's incredibly important to be aware of how all of those different things can impact interpretation, even in small things like icons. They're there.
Yeah. And I think what stands out to me and what you've just said is, like, people always ask us, are there ubiquitous icons? And yes, there might be. But at the same time, even the ubiquitous icons depend on a lot more than just being ubiquitous icons, right? Like they can have different meanings depending on where we put them. Like I know you mentioned the little head figure silhouette. Like in one place in that upper right corner or whatever, it might mean profile, but at the bottom of a phone might mean people, right? Or it might mean
Exactly.
contacts. And then another one is like the plus sign, right? A plus sign next to some words might mean, okay, I'm creating something new, but then maybe a plus sign in another context means increasing the size, right? So even the ones that maybe seem to have universal meanings can vary in their meaning depending on where they're placed or how they're used.
Absolutely. I mean, you're exactly right. The position of an icon has a huge impact on how people assign meaning to it. The proximity of that icon to other things in the interface has a huge impact on how people understand it and interpret it. So are there ubiquitous icons? Are there universal icons? I'm gonna say no. There are not universal icons, because even icons that have strong shared primary associations, what they mean can be greatly different and can be interpreted very differently depending on all these little factors, like the ones you're bringing up, and some of those cultural contexts as well, and background and lived experience context too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Were there any icons, like as you were looking at them? So if we don't have ubiquitous or universal icons, then are there any that are like universally bad icons? I feel like there have to be. Like, I know I've seen some where I'm like, what even is this? This is a blob. But like,
Yeah.
were there any that stood out to you as unhelpful in particular?
Yeah, there's a host of things that can make an icon, let's just say nicely, unhelpful. There's two kind of aspects to unpack here when it comes to icon usability. I think two important things are recognizability, which is like, do people look at the shape and understand what you are trying to draw there? Can they recognize that star is a star, for example? And then there is, how do they interpret it and assign meaning to it? Does the star mean favorites? Does the star mean something special? Does it mean a reward? When it comes to the first part of that recognizability, one of the biggest themes in, again, unhelpful icons that we encountered was just too much detail, right? So I mean, I'm sure when people are designing icons, we're looking at them in different formats, sometimes in some phases of the design, than users actually encounter them on a screen. I mean, it can be really tempting to pack them with detail in a really good attempt to contextualize and add these different layers of meaning and really explain the concept that it's representing. But those things often get missed, ignored, or they kind of muddy up what people are seeing. So too much detail is one of the themes here. There's like a set of icon principles that I provide in the book based on some of these findings from the research, and just singular ideas is one of them. I saw that when people encounter an icon that has more than one concept that's trying to be contained within one format, they often ignore, don't recognize, or just shut out those secondary concepts anyway and go with the primary concept. So, for example, one that comes to mind is using a magnifying glass, which people very well understand to mean search. Right? It's one of the pretty ubiquitous icons. But then people will take that shape because it does have a primary association and try to put something else in it, like a little heartbeat line. I remember one of them had that was supposed to represent diagnostics, right? And people were like, I don't know, it's searching, because they have such a strong primary association with that magnifying glass that they ignored those secondary details.
I see. Yeah, that would make sense too. Like if there's such a strong attachment to meaning for one, like search, like you're saying, one that we see in almost every single interface, then it can be hard to kind of detach that, or even if you add like a little extra detail. But it's funny you mentioned like the heartbeat line. I have seen that in relation to diagnostics, but at the same time, now that I'm reflecting on it, like seeing it in a different context would probably be a little bit confusing as well. So that's very tricky. I can see that being really challenging as well.
I feel like that's why we, broken record from a UX researcher, need to test our icons, both within the context of our, within the context of design, because, I would consider the heartbeat icon kind of something I kind of categorized in the book as an emerging icon, because it's becoming a little bit more prolific across different types of interfaces. But there are emerging icons that might feel ubiquitous to one community, that might have a really strong association to one community, but they're still meaningless, at best outside of that community. The Sparkles icon is a good example of this. And when I say the Sparkles icon, I mean just like that group of glitzy little stars or twinkles. I think in the UX community, or at least the tech community, like we have a pretty probably strong shared primary association with that sparkles icon because it's being used across a lot of our products that we might encounter to represent like AI or AI feature or something AI does. But yeah, exactly. Special magic, it's kind of like all over the products that we use. But this was really interesting to me, Therese. We might have that association, but I was very interested in testing this sparkles icon. And so it was part of qualitative and quantitative testing. And when people were exposed to the sparkles icon, different variations of it, both in and out of context, guess how many people associated with artificial intelligence?
I would say low number based on the tone you're taking. It sounds like not many. Were there any people who did?
There was not one person, Therese, not one person, literally no one used the words AI or artificial intelligence when they were kind of predicting or describing what they believed that icon would do in interfaces. They said it was something special. We generally agree on that, but real ambiguity beyond that association.
Interesting. Yeah, because when I think of the sparkles or just the concept of something sparkly and shiny, like you're saying, what comes to mind is like something special or new, maybe. I've seen that used in the past pre-AI buzz, pre-AI hype. I've seen that icon related to like trending content or new content as opposed to like something else. So it's interesting to see how that's kind of evolved.
Yeah, it's one of the topics that you're bringing up that's worth kind of teasing out is that that's where the ambiguity comes from with emerging icons. They're being used inconsistently across different interfaces to mean different things. And until there's a standard in how that icon is used, there'll always be ambiguity and wild interpretations in how people really, what they believe it represents.
Yeah. And it's funny, you mentioned how like meaning can change based on people's ages or context or like context of use specifically. I think about my own age and like being a millennial, there's certain icons that we learn to use. And we're kind of that generation that got a chance to be free of screens and then grew up with like learning how to use computers, and even computers themselves were like working out the iconography as we were working out how to use them. And like one that comes to mind is like the save button. Like, is that a hieroglyph at this point? Like, I think about other generations, newer generations who might see this floppy disk, which back then we had floppy disks and that's how we actually saved files. But obviously we don't use floppy disks anymore. And even the concept of like hard storage is starting to kind of fade as we have things like cloud storage. So like, when do icons kind of become hieroglyphic versus helpful? Is there anything that we can use as a reference for that?
Yeah, I think I love talking about the infamous floppy disks, Therese. So I'm here for it. I think that the high level thing to remember is that icons are really a language. They're just a visual language we're trying to communicate with. And like any language, they're going to be evolving. Some are going to come into the dictionary. Some are going to fade out of the dictionary. Some are going to take on new meaning. Some are going to lose meaning. And I think the floppy disk is a perfect example of that. And I want to give you a little morsel of data from the book here.
Yeah, did you study floppy disks? Let's dig in.
Let's ask the real question here. Yeah, we did test the floppy disk icon in our quant study. And when we showed the floppy disk icon to people out of context and we asked them what it meant, a pretty good chunk, 83% of people said that's saving, right? And there were even more people that said that's a data disk, that's a storage card. We didn't code those the same because we were being kind of cautious with interpreting meaning. But at least 83% even cautiously associated that symbol with saving. Like, so the infamous question, like, do people still know what the floppy disk is? Like, it's not even around anymore. Like, the answer is kind of like, yeah, they do, at least with the general kind of US-based population that we tested, which is an important, context here. But I think it's fascinating that that's the case because the reference of that icon, the floppy disk itself, right? There's no arguing that is obsolete. Like, It's not in our offices anymore. We don't use it. But what it is referring to, right? The meaning it is trying to attempt is still connected there, right? Even though a lot of people, maybe most people at this point, I don't know, have never held that relic in their hand, they still associate it with saving. So I think as long as an icon is reliably communicating the intended message at hand, there's some argument there that it's a good choice. But this language is in constant evolution, right? So this data even is just a snapshot in time. When an icon can no longer reliably communicate what it's intended to convey, it's time to say, thank you, floppy disk, and you may be retired now, right? So even though
it's time to Marie Kondo the floppy disk.
Yeah, right.
Say thank you for your service. And
is it bringing you joy? And like you mentioned, like I would predict, that the floppy disk will continue to become more and more distant in terms of that original thing it references, because just the changing nature of the platforms and products that we use, where people are continuing to be less and less exposed to physical save buttons because of features like autosave and web-based applications, like you mentioned. So TBD, I don't know what the lifespan of the icons are, but we're going to stay open and curious about that.
Yeah. I remember I was watching some like documentary, and I think it had to do with like the evolution of language. And like one thing that came up was like the concept of like these nuclear waste facilities, and how there's this fear that if they outlive people and language, that if there's some other civilization that stumbles upon it, that we need to somehow convey that this is like toxic, or somehow convey that this is dangerous. And like, because language might evolve so much, like a lot of these folks who are designing these warning labels are like trying to design things that are primarily image based, where we can kind of convey the danger in those particular ways, because that meaning can kind of outlast, or at least the idea is that meaning can outlast the language, even if the language itself is like moved on. But like you're saying, it is a visual language, and one that often relies on like analogies. And if the analogy becomes obsolete, or even the technology changes, where even the concept of saving itself might become obsolete, which is exciting to think about, but also, wow, like just to think about how that may change. Of course, that may naturally change the visual language too.
Yeah. I think that like, conversely to the kind of antiquated talk about the floppy disk and whether or not it's still an appropriate choice to represent saving, is you have the converse as well. On the other end, there are these new emerging ideas for visual symbols to communicate information that are getting added to our icon dictionary, if you will, and those icons, just like one of them I would consider is the sparkles icon, like we were talking about earlier. Those are also part of this change in language and this constant evolution, and those icons will either reach a standard at some point and become more ubiquitous and well understood over time, depending on how they're adopted and applied consistently or not to different interfaces, and how many people are really exposed to them over time. But yeah, like any language, icons are not stagnant, right? They're subject to the same natural life cycle of languages that you were just talking about for all kinds of communication, and they're influenced by all kinds of shifts in the world, not just evolution of physical products that we're using, but also how we use devices to communicate, how we, come to use new and different emerging technologies. Even pop culture is influential over our symbols that we use to convey ideas. There's a lot of inputs here.
Yeah, it sounds like our work's cut out for us, in that we're going to have plenty of research to continue doing as language evolves, as technology evolves. So I guess to kind of close, do you have advice for teams who are looking to incorporate iconography into their designs? Like, I know you had a few principles or guidelines that you were mentioning earlier, like simple icons are often going to be better. Any other tips when it comes to iconography and how to make sure that people are applying it the right way?
Yeah, just to be like even kind of more philosophical in nature than kind of design-based guidelines, I would just say, stay curious. Like I said, icons are an evolving language. Anything that we know about them is useful to apply, but they they're going to continue to evolve and shift meaning over time. So stay open to learning and collaborating and testing icons with diverse groups of people. I think that's especially important as scaling of technology continues to happen, cross-cultural UX and products continue to grow and scale. That just means more people with more diverse backgrounds are going to be encountering and using our designs. So test your icons with diverse groups of people. Hire diverse groups of people in the first place to work on your designs. And just don't treat icons as an afterthought, right? They have a huge impact, which can be positive or negative on the overall experience. Even though they are subtle yet sophisticated, like a good wine, they're contributing messages. And those messages can be intentional if we don't treat them like an afterthought, or unintentionally harmful, right? If we don't treat them like an afterthought, we can create icons that are conveying messages that are helpful, supportive, inclusive, and kind, because they do consider the multitude of factors that influence how people interpret them and what kind of meaning they're communicating.
Yeah. So it sounds like not just using them as like a little stickers to decorate our interfaces and like, oh, let's just make it look a little bit nicer, but really thinking about their functionality, thinking about who it's going to help, and maybe treating it a little bit less like an exercise in vanity, but more an exercise in care and consideration about what are we ultimately communicating and what are people ultimately learning and taking away from the interfaces we're putting in front of them. Yeah, I think that's something I can get behind too.
Yeah. Icons are not sprinkles on the cake, right? Just like any flavor or spice you would be adding to a dish you're making, they need to be layered in and intentionally part of the recipe at all stages, right? They need to be taste tested throughout the process. They need to be a part of the recipe you're creating, not something you throw on top at the end.
Yes, I love these wine and food metaphors, and it's making me hungry, making me excited. Yeah. So for those who are hungry for more icon stuff, the good news is you have a book, correct? I believe at the time this is going to be published, it will be available for purchase. Could you tell us a little bit more about that book? What is it called? How can people get it?
I'm so excited to share all this research in this book. The book is called Digital Icons That Work. And the idea is we want to create icons that work, that do a job, just like we were talking about at the beginning of this episode. I want to make sure that there's something useful in the book for people who want to make design-related decisions, who have their own nagging questions related to icons. So it's kind of a reference book. The vision is that hopefully it's entertaining, but also that there's a great amount of data in there. There's a lot of data shared about how people interpret different types of icons across many, many different categories of actions and functions. And so we kind of break down the different categories of actions that icons are often used to communicate and how strong those associations are, and provide a lot of guidance and a lot of insights from the research. It's all out there. I'm really excited to share it.
Yes, and we're excited to read it. So we'll include links to buy it. I believe this is going to be our available through NNG Press, which is a very exciting development for us at NNG. We're excited to be putting out lots more references, resources for people. And otherwise, Kate, if people want to follow you on social media or want to learn more from you and your research, where could you point them?
Oh, absolutely. So stay tuned to just the nngroup.com website. We'll be publishing some bits of the icon related research there as well. Also, if you want to follow me on social, you can always connect with me on LinkedIn. We can talk icons. We can do a virtual tea chat about icons. It's just Kate W. Kaplan.
Amazing. Well, Kate, thank you so much for talking about icons with me. I always love nerding out about these concepts and these small but mighty assets that people can use to really make their interfaces just go to the next level. I appreciate it and looking forward to diving into this book and what work is left to come. So I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Absolutely, Therese. Thank you.
That was Kate Kaplan. You can find her latest book, Digital Icons That Work, on Amazon. And All of her articles and videos can be found on our website, along with many others on UX design, research, and strategy, and UX careers for that matter. So, to learn about that, or if you want to continue to get notified about our research like this or episodes like these, then you can find all of that information at www.nngroup.com. That's nngroup.com. And if you like this show and want to support us, please leave a rating and follow or subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. This show was hosted by me, Therese Fessenden, and produced and edited by the amazing Chrissy Richardson. That's it for today's show. Until next time, remember, keep it simple.